The lower esophageal sphincter, or LOS, as this highly intelligent, pressure-sensitive gate. Under normal conditions, it is an absolute marvel. It functions flawlessly. And what's really cool is how it adapts to your environment. When you lie down, entering that supine position where gravity isn't helping to keep your stomach contents down anymore, the pressure inside the LOS naturally rises. It actively tightens up to block the reflux. It's literally acting like an automatic safety valve.
We actually owe a massive amount of our understanding here to a researcher named Dent. He made this huge breakthrough by discovering the importance of TLSRs, which stands for transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxations. Basically, these are just brief, temporary relaxations of that gatekeeper we just talked about, and they're completely separate from the relaxations that happen when you consciously swallow food. These little, brief openings, they're the primary mechanism for your normal, everyday healthy reflux.
Then along comes another pioneer, Demeester, and he maps out what are basically the literal engineering requirements for this valve to stay competent and leak-free. It turns out it's not just about having a tight squeeze. Competence is governed by its basal pressure, its overall physical length, and crucially, the specific length of the sphincter that is actually exposed to intra-abdominal pressure. If these physical dimensions and pressures are off by even a tiny fraction, the whole system breaks down.
So, let's walk through exactly how this breakdown happens in real life. It happens in steps. In the early stages of GORD, it starts simply as an increased number of those transient relaxations. Basically, the gate just opens a bit too often. As the disease progresses, the sphincter actually loses its basal tone. Its resting grip gets weaker and weaker. And finally, in severe GORD, you're looking at a total structural failure. The length of the intra-abdominal esophagus becomes much shorter than normal, meaning it completely loses that supportive, clamping pressure from the abdomen.
That brings us to Section 3, Root Causes of GERD, Why the Gate Fails. The really crucial point to grasp here is that GERD isn't just a one-trick pony. The culprits behind it are incredibly diverse. Structurally, something like a sliding hiatus hernia can compromise the valve. Or it could be systemic. Collagen diseases like scleroderma can cause a massive loss of sphincter tone. Sometimes it's just a downstream plumbing issue, like impaired gastric outlet emptying, where your stomach simply isn't emptying fast enough. And finally, surgical culprits. Destructive operations like resections, cardioplasties, or a badly performed myotomy can actually bypass or completely destroy this built-in competence mechanism.
Actually, hold on a second. I want to pause on hernias real quick to clear up a super common medical confusion. We need to contrast a sliding hiatus hernia with a rolling or paraesophageal hernia. While patients with severe GORD often do have a sliding hernia, the vast majority of people walking around with this type of hernia actually don't have significant reflux at all. Crazy, right? But the rolling hernia, that is a completely different and potentially very dangerous structural condition. It is absolutely vital not to mix these two up when looking at structural risks. All right, heading into our final section, Section 4, Modern Trends and Complications, Lifestyle Impacts. I want to throw this question out to you to kick off this section. Why is GORD, by far, the most common upper gastrointestinal condition in westernized countries today? Think about it. It sets up this truly fascinating paradox between the triumphs of modern medicine and, well, the pitfalls of our modern lifestyle. Just look at how the dynamics have shifted over the last 30 years. It's wild. On the decreasing side, better socioeconomic conditions have drastically reduced Helicobacter pylori infections. And because of that, we've seen a massive, fantastic drop in peptic ulcers. That is a huge win for medicine. But on the flip side, rising obesity rates are putting tremendous upward physical pressure on our stomachs. And here is the really crazy part. The lack of that H.Pylori bacteria might actually lead to increased acid secretion. The net result of all this, an absolute explosion in GERD incidence and, tragically, a parallel rise in lower esophageal cancer. Because here is the harsh reality. When that mechanical gate fails, the chemical consequences are just brutal. And the damaging agents at play aren't just stomach acid. Oh no, it's acid peptic contents, bile, and even pancreatic secretions creeping their way up into the lower esophagus. Your delicate esophageal mucosa simply is not built to handle those kinds of caustic fluids. The severity of the resulting inflammation, a complication we call reflux esophagitis, depends entirely on two things: the concentration of those nasty fluids and exactly how long they stay in contact with your tissue.
This transparent 3D cutaway shows a healthy human thorax, zooming in to focus on a properly closed gastroesophageal junction. Under normal physiological conditions, this barrier remains tight, sealing the highly acidic environment of the stomach away from the delicate tissues above it. The primary mechanical failure initiating gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, occurs right here. The lower esophageal sphincter, or LES, undergoes a transient relaxation, rendering it incompetent. With the physical barrier compromised, gastric acid and pepsin flow freely in a retrograde direction, washing directly upward into the distal esophagus. The esophageal lining is not equipped for this chemical exposure. The initial morphological response is a superficial reddening and erythema of the squamous mucosa, a finding classified clinically as grade 1 esophagitis.
The clinical presentation of GERD encompasses secondary neuromuscular spasms, severe histological changes, and systemic microaspiration alongside basic chemical irritation. Because this disease involves both physical tissue destruction and invisible mechanical dysfunction, diagnosing it accurately requires a multimodal approach. Clinicians must pair structural imaging of the damage with precise physiological testing of the sphincter's function. Tracking the refluxate as it ascends from the incompetent LES into the lower and mid-esophagus reveals how specific symptoms develop. Patients typically report retrosternal pain, which actually stems from two distinct origins. The first is direct mucosal chemical irritation, which the patient perceives as a burning sensation. The second origin is secondary esophageal muscle spasm triggered by that very irritation. This spastic pain has a very specific clinical presentation. It is highly posture-dependent, worsening when lying down, stooping, or wearing tight abdominal garments. Because this spastic pain often radiates down the arms, it closely mimics the presentation of angina pectoris. These same spastic motor disorders, directly triggered by mucosal irritation, are also the initial functional cause of dysphagia, or difficulty swallowing. Over time, the dysphagia progresses from a functional issue to a morphological one. Repeated direct tissue injury causes localized edema. This leads to chronic inflammation, and as the tissue attempts to heal, it lays down thick fibrotic scarring. In advanced cases, this heavy fibrosis culminates in a frank stricture. The esophageal wall stiffens and narrows, causing a complete mechanical obstruction of the lumen. Beyond narrowing, the acid causes ulceration. The severity of bleeding from these ulcers is entirely dictated by the underlying histology of the tissue. Looking at this side-by-side histological cross-section, the left panel demonstrates how ulcers form on the native squamous epithelium of the esophagus. They typically remain shallow and superficial. On the right side, we see the contrasting histology of Barrett's esophagus. The chronic acid exposure has caused the native cells to undergo metaplasia, transforming into gastric-type columnar epithelium. Because of this cellular shift, ulcerations here can penetrate significantly deeper into the tissue wall. When an ulcer breaches the underlying vascular bed so deeply, it presents with specific clinical signs. Patients frequently develop chronic anemia and test positive for occult blood in their stool. Localized lower esophageal symptoms are the dual result of direct chemical tissue destruction and the body's own secondary neuromuscular and fibrotic defense mechanisms reacting to that injury. Continuing superiorly, the refluxate eventually reaches the top of the esophagus, encountering the upper esophageal sphincter. Acid exposure at this upper boundary triggers acute irritation, which rapidly induces a protective spasm of the cricopharyngeal sphincter. This specific cricopharyngeal spasm is responsible for a classic patient complaint, the persistent sensation of a foreign body lodged in the throat, known as the Globus sensation, frequently accompanied by an inability to initiate swallowing. If the upper esophageal sphincter is breached, minute amounts of gastric contents escape into the pharynx. This anatomical map highlights the three distinct paths this microaspiration can take: oral, laryngeal, and pulmonary. Following the pulmonary path, chronic aspiration into the lungs introduces acid directly into the lower respiratory tract. This causes asthma exacerbations, chronic cough, and in severe cases, recurrent pneumonia and lung abscesses. The laryngeal and oral paths result in upper airway damage. The vocal cords become inflamed, leading to chronic hoarseness and laryngitis, while acid reaching the oral cavity causes direct dental erosion. There is a critical diagnostic caveat here. While respiratory symptoms frequently accompany GERD, clinicians must determine if they are definitively caused by the reflux events or merely associative.
A transient mechanical failure at the distal sphincter can systematically compromise the entire respiratory and upper aerodigestive tracts, making the clinical picture highly complex. To map the extent of this disease, clinicians begin with standard structural diagnostic tools, typically starting with radiography via a barium swallow. The primary clinical utility of a barium swallow is to map gross anatomical abnormalities. It efficiently identifies hiatal hernias, established peptic strictures, and instances of delayed gastric emptying. However, as this statistical visualization demonstrates, the modality has a critical limitation. Because it only captures a brief snapshot in time, radiologists fail to observe spontaneous free gastroesophageal reflux in approximately 50% of patients who are ultimately confirmed to have the disorder. To achieve direct morphological assessment and overcome this high false negative rate, the clinical gold standard is flexible video endoscopy. This clinical matrix outlines the standardized endoscopic grading scale, which categorizes the physical damage from grade 0 to grade 4. The pathology progresses from grade 1 erythema to grade 2 ulceration to grade 3 wall stiffening, up to grade 4 frank stricture. Endoscopy also allows for direct tissue sampling. To accurately diagnose Barrett's esophagus and its metaplastic changes, the required protocol dictates that biopsies must be taken more than 3 centimeters above the gastroesophageal junction. Modern flexible endoscopy, which can be performed as an outpatient procedure without general anesthesia, has rendered traditional rigid esophagoscopy largely obsolete for routine lower gastrointestinal evaluation. Rigid instruments do retain one specific clinical indication. They provide superior unobstructed visualization of the complex lower pharynx and cricopharyngeal area, a region where flexible endoscopes offer a poorer view. For examining the deep layers of the esophageal wall beneath the mucosa, clinicians utilize endoscopic ultrasonography, or EUS. In cases of severe disease progression, EUS is highly effective for staging adenocarcinoma and facilitating fine needle aspiration of adjacent, potentially compromised lymph nodes. A limitation remains. Endoscopic tools map the physical damage left behind by acid, but they cannot measure the transient dynamic pressure failures that initiate the disease. This leaves the 50% of patients who exhibit severe symptoms but no active structural reflux during standard imaging. Evaluating them requires physiological function tests. The first of these tests is high-resolution esophageal manometry, deployed via a transnasal catheter. This 2D pressure topography map dynamically tracks esophageal peristalsis. By utilizing a warm and cold color gradient, it identifies exact pressure deficits in the lower esophageal sphincter in real time, showing precisely when and where the mechanical barrier fails. The ultimate physiological monitor is the 24-hour ambulatory multi-channel intraluminal impedance pH test. While traditional pH monitoring only tracks acidity, impedance testing detects the physical presence of refluxate. This gives it the unique capability to register non-acid liquid and gaseous reflux events that pH testing completely misses. Functional testing translates invisible neuromuscular deficits into measurable, actionable clinical data, providing a detailed map of the patient's esophageal physiology. This cinematic pullback through the thorax reverses the pathophysiological timeline, tracing the pathology from permanent strictures back through active inflammation to the initial sphincter relaxation. Reflux esophagitis is driven by a core duality. It is the combination of direct chemical tissue injury and the complex secondary neuromuscular spasms that arise in response. For clinicians, the core diagnostic rule is to bridge the gap between a patient's subjective symptoms and objective, measurable disease markers. Achieving this requires a multimodal diagnostic pathway. The structural assessment of flexible endoscopy must be seamlessly integrated with the functional mapping of high-resolution manometry and impedance testing. By precisely matching the diagnostic tool to the anatomical and functional stage of the disease, clinicians can ensure accurate staging, mitigate the risk of adenocarcinoma, and deliver targeted, effective intervention.